Well, I just returned from the funeral of Officer Decker, and that puts everything in a perspective, and I'd like to ask for just a brief moment of silence in his honor. It's very, very hard to look in the eyes of especially four children who are at the ages of 8, 6, 4, and 2, and just try to imagine, what life now holds for them and how different it is, and their struggle to comprehend even the enormity of what's occurred. So, a hard morning. The forecast contains some good news, some bad news, and a lot of uncertainty. The good news is that we are able to repay the schools $1.3 billion thanks to the increased revenues for the rest of this fiscal year. And that means, combined with what was paid off last spring, we've repaid about $1.6 billion out of the $2.7 billion that we owed the schools, so that's important progress. But there's still $1.1 billion deficit projected for the next year, and because of the school repayment, we start the year with a zero balance. The budget I proposed last year to the legislature with raising income taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans would have given us a balanced budget. We would not have needed to borrow $750 million more from the schools, and we'd be able to carry forward a good part of that, this additional revenue for this year into next year, and the budget that I proposed would also have started us off with a very slight surplus for the next biennium. So we're worse off than we should be and could have been if we had responsible budgeting in the previous 2 years. And obviously, the $1.1 billion is going to be difficult to come up with. The last biennium, Commissioner Just and I and Commissioner Showalter cut about $1.2 billion out of the Health and Human Services budget, and obviously that carries forward into these next 2 years, but it makes it even that much more difficult to look for further reductions there or anywhere else. And we cut higher education by 15% in the last biennium, or now, and we can't continue to do that. And since education and health and human services account for 80% of our budget, more than 80, I think it just underscores how challenging this is going to be. And I think that, unfortunately, we have a miniature version of the federal government, with the years of previous fiscal irresponsibility are now landing on our heads, and we have the school shift, and what still remains, we have a almost $1.1 billion deficit projected for the next biennium. We have this whole capital complex that was ignored and avoided, and so that we have to absorb the bonding costs of that in ways that are going to prevent other investments in other projects around the state. So it's a legacy that we're cleaning up, but we still have a ways to go, and it constricts what we're able to do in the immediate future. I respond to questions.
Governor, it sounds like you say we'd be better off if the legislature had approved your 2%, or the tax increase on the 2%. Is that likely to be included in your budget proposal in February?
Well, in terms of our own budget preparation, now we're just beginning. We're waiting for this number. We've talked conceptually. We haven't made any decisions about anything at this point. So I just, I don't have any answers for you today in terms of the tax side of it or the spending side of it. But obviously, we got to come up with a budget that would be balanced for the rest of the biennium, next biennium, while recognizing that the forecast is going to change the end of February, and as Dr. Stinson, everybody else has pointed out to you, I'm sure, the uncertainty factor in this forecast is particularly high, and we're going to all be affected strongly by what does or doesn't happen in Washington before that forecast is issued. So, even after I emphasize that my budget will be the first word, but it's certainly not going to be the last word.
You did campaign on that. You also pushed for it in your first year in office. So, can we expect that is very likely to be included in your proposal?
You expect that it's very likely.
Governor, forecast assumes that the President and Congress will avoid going over the so-called fiscal cliff. After visiting with officials in Washington yesterday, are you comfortable with that portion of the forecast?
Well, it's still to be determined. Where there's a will, there's a way. There's certainly a way. I mean, the broad parameters of what the Democrats want in terms of a revenue increase, which I would point out, most of the responsible Republican leaders in Washington have said is necessary, a revenue increase, unspecified what that is. And, the spending reductions that the Republican caucus in the House has proposed, which I'm pointing out again, are in addition to over $1 trillion in spending reductions that occurred earlier this year. So to take those two combined, and you're in the beginning to be in the ballpark of what they want to accomplish, or certainly what they could accomplish in the rest of this year, and then carry forward what they have to into the future. So, I think they'll reach an agreement because the means to do so are there, and I think everybody understands the very risky push over the fiscal cliff and unforeseeable consequences of pushing the country there and into a very serious recession, which nobody wants. So I'm hopeful.
Governor, the Star Tribune is reporting that stadium revenue projections are down in this thing because of the pull tabs. What do you attribute that to, and is that going to turn around?
Well, talking with Commissioner Doman on the way to this service, there are several factors, and I can't do them justice here but we could certainly provide you with that information. But there's a lag in this. There's a lag in the startup that has to do with firms who are waiting to see what other games are available before they commit to a contract. Because once they commit to a contract with one vendor, then they're tied down with that one. So it's been slower getting underway. The background checks are taking a considerable time, and I think we're going to have to go out and market the opportunity. And the Commissioner said there are enterprises like Cub Foods that are under the law qualified, eligible to allow these games, and we're going to need to have somebody go out and market the opportunities. So I think we'll catch up. We're slightly behind now, but we'll get there.
Are you concerned that there will not be enough revenue for this?
I've always been concerned because the legislature chopped it up last year. The House leadership insisted on a distribution between the revenues we needed and what they sent elsewhere that really put it on a very thin margin, and any downturn or any loss of that pace was going to have this effect. So I'm concerned. I was concerned when the bill was finally passed because of that, but that was the best we could do.
Are the electronic pull tabs just less popular than people thought they were going to be?
I don't have that information. I don't believe so. I think it's, as I say, this logistical pace of getting the whole thing going is just, the projection is 2,500 sites, and we're not very close to that at this point. So it's going to take longer than it was expected to ramp up, but I'm told the sites that are operating are doing very well. So hopefully that will carry forward into the others.
Will provisions for the possibility of going over the fiscal cliff be part of your assembling your budget proposal for next month?
Probably not. I mean, I'll make the same assumptions that the forecast makes here. You know, I'm not required, or even, I don't think permitted, to submit, you know, multiple budget proposals depending on certain variables. The governor of Utah said that he is required to prepare two budgets, and he has one without the cliff, which is a $400 million surplus, and another one with the cliff that has a $500 million deficit. And so, you know, for Utah, that's a significant percentage of their operations. So, you know, so the variance that would be called for if we do go over the cliff, and if it's unresolved when the next forecast is made, would be very severe, and you know, it'll be a nightmare for everybody. And I think we're being reasonable here. I think that, you know, as I said, the odds are very much in favor of it getting resolved. So that's what we're going to base the budget on.
Governor, are you concerned at all if Congress raises taxes by the Bush tax cuts expiring or through whatever means, and then taxes are also raised at the state level? Republicans are concerned that double whammy will have a major impact on the economy. Are you concerned about that at all, what you do at the state level, how it might intertwine with what happens at the federal level?
Well, I keep pointing out that I'm not proposing to raise taxes on all Minnesotans, and I didn't propose that for the last 2 years. I proposed to raise taxes on the wealthiest 2%, and I think they can afford both of those increases. You know, they were paying the higher rates during the 1990s when President Clinton was in office, and we enjoyed boom years in the state. They had the highest real per capita real family income in 1999 that we've had in our history, and now since then we've dropped almost 9% from that high in the aftermath of the Minnesota tax cuts, 1999 2000, and also the Bush tax cuts in 2001, 2003. So I understand the very wealthiest people don't want to pay any more in taxes, but they're paying less than they did 20 years ago, and you know, we're looking at a serious deficit in the state. We're looking at a catastrophic deficit at the federal level, and somebody's got to do something about it. And it can't all be cuts, and even the Republicans in the Congress have recognized that reality. So, you know, they can play all the political games that they want but that wasn't what people said in the election in November. They said they want us to roll up our sleeves and work together and solve this problem and do it in a fair and balanced way, and that's what we aim to do.
Governor, you talked about how difficult it would be to cut anything more out of health and human services, and we've already made deep cuts in higher education. Then where is there room to cut?
Well, we got to go. We have to go back. We'll have to go across the board. We're looking at every agency. We're looking at every program. We're looking at every expenditure, and we'll continue to do so. I didn't mean to say that health and human services or higher ed were exempted from this. I mean, we'll probably have to take something from everywhere. But again, we haven't specified that. But the fact is, we did cut them last time.
Earlier today, the commissioner stressed how important it was to stop having these structural deficits, in large part by using these one-time, for lack of a better word, gimmicks. How committed are you to coming up with a balanced budget without using shifts?
Very committed. Absolutely committed. We're done with the gimmicks. We're done with the games. And I would just point out, and the commissioner can articulate this better than I, but you know, we'll see this attempt to compare this year's biennium with last year's in terms of both revenue and spending, and it's not a valid comparison because of the shifts, nor is it a valid comparison with the biennium before. So some will try to say, oh, this is a 4.7% increase in spending. Well, it's not. It's not an accurate comparison. You need that comparison. So the gimmicks have really muddied up the issue for everyone, and they said they were the reason that we're Still paying off the school shift, which they instituted, and as a result, the additional revenues that we gained for this biennium will not carry forward into the next biennium, which puts us further behind in the next biennium. Capital renovations totally avoided. There's just a lot of avoidance and a lot of gimmicks and a lot of unwillingness to take responsibility for the situation that faced them at that moment in time. And we're not going to perpetuate that. We're going to make tough decisions. There'll be unpopular decisions, be hard decisions, but that's what we're going to do.
Governor, so far you're standing by your income tax increase proposal. Democratic leaders have been very reluctant today and in the last few weeks to talk tax increases at all. How concerned are you about getting that proposal through the legislature, even though it's all DFL?
Well, again, I have the first word when I submit my budget. And then I'll actually revise that based on the end of February forecast. And governor's proposed, legislature's disposed. It's finally their decision to make, and I'll certainly be in discussion about that. But I don't presume anything, and they all 201 of them were elected in their own right, and they have a perfect right to impose their will over mine. But they're going to have to deal with the need to balance a budget, and so if they're not going to bring in more revenues, they're going to have to take it all out in spending cuts, and then they're going to need to find out where to do that. We never got to the point, 2 years ago in 2011, where we had the majority party telling us in a straight, honest way where they were going to make the cuts to get down to $32 billion or $34 billion. They just had these broad kind of fabricated concepts, kind of constructs. So, when we finally get down to the final decision-making, anybody to say who doesn't want a balanced approach is going to have to tell us what the unbalanced approach is going to be.
Should Minnesotans expect an income tax increase?
The wealthiest 2%. I don't know how many times I've said this every time for the last 2 years now. Only the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans have I ever proposed raising income taxes on. And I haven't proposed raising any other tax. And the property tax increases, which have hit most Minnesotans, if you talk about a tax increase in a general term, it's property tax increases. And that's primarily because of the Republican cuts for local government aids and their elimination of the homestead credit. And I don't take responsibility for either of those because I propose doing otherwise. So one last time, top 2%, wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans.
Money that would bring in, maybe the commissioner knows, is there a current estimate?
Last year, the projection of the last biennium was $1.1 billion. So I figure it's probably about the same. I don't know the effects of this capital gains, cashing in for whether that affects the income for the next biennium. I suppose it does, but the billion is probably a reasonable ballpark.
It's over 2 years, right?
Yes, correct.
I just want to be very clear about something. You're saying you've never proposed anything except for the wealthiest, the income tax hike on the wealthiest 2%. Are you making that commitment when you release your budget in January?
I'm not making any commitments because, again, this is the starting point for us. We talked broadly about the revenue side, and we've talked broadly about the expenditure side, but we've been waiting for this number. This gives us our mark, and so now we really go to work on the specifics, and I'm not making any commitments or prognosis on any of the other aspects.
Time for one more question.
In the past week or so, a couple of task forces have come in with recommendations for pretty hefty tax increases for transportation and education. What are you saying to those groups?
Well, the transportation, I didn't see the report before it was released, and I didn't want to be involved in its finalization. I told that task force their charge is totally independent of me and totally independent really of MnDOT, is take a fresh look at an expert's view, and they all brought different kinds of expertise as to what we need to do in Minnesota if we're going to have an improved transportation system. If we're not going to have a continuation of the deterioration that we've experienced over the last 20 years, which is yet another area where my predecessors avoided their responsibilities to deal with the situation. So, I'm not a proponent of the gas tax as an increase because it doesn't solve the problem. We're beyond that. And actually, President Obama yesterday asked the governors for their advice in how to set up a national infrastructure initiative, because highways are part of the sewer and water. All sorts of infrastructure improvements are not being made, and frankly, I don't know what the answer is. There's revenues and there's debt, and both the state and the nation are restricted in how much, particularly in debt, they can go farther they can go. But so I have taken no position on the, but I thank them for their work, and I think they've laid it out. If we continue just where we are now, that level of effort, we're going to have continued deterioration in our highway system. That means more congestion, longer drive times, worse roads, and that's not a pleasant prospect. But no one can say now that we haven't been forewarned. And I'll be asking the legislature, obviously, what they, what thoughts they have on the school financing. As I said to the group operates wholly independently from me. It's if it's a zero-sum game, you have winners and losers, and that becomes very difficult in my experience in trying to reform something. If you can put extra money, and this one calls for an additional $638 million, which we don't have, to mitigate the losses for those that would lose out, you're still going to have opposition on that basis alone, but it would be easier to accomplish. And of course, current Representative Greiling, her proposal had an additional $2 billion to make that transition. So if those days come again, I think it's something to look at. I mean, I think everybody says in concept we want a fair and equitable approach to funding public education for every school child in Minnesota, and the Minnesota Supreme Court said, 41 years ago, that's a constitutional requirement. And I've thought for the last few years that if somebody were to bring that kind of lawsuit again to the Minnesota Supreme Court, that I would think that if they were going to follow the precedent of the earlier one, that they'd come up with the same conclusion, that we're not constitutional in the inequities in our funding. I don't know that we'll have the ability to do anything about that this time around.
Thank you all.
Okay. All right. Thank you.